Hi gang, so Secret Level Episode 5 and They Shall Know No Fear is out on Amazon Prime, and as well as the many 40k fans who will be, I guess, eagerly tuning in, it's likely that there's going to be a lot of newcomers to 40k who are wondering just what exactly is going on. So in this video, I'm going to go through what happens in the episode and try and explain just who all of these super soldiers and demon sorcerers actually are. So it's been awaited for a little while now, but Secret Level, Amazon's new series that collects together stories from different video games, have released their first Warhammer episode, Episode 5, and They Shall Know No Fear. It's a little bit of a weird inclusion because, of course, Warhammer primarily isn't a video games franchise. It started out as a tabletop game which has developed into this massive, all-consuming IP, but occasionally it has video games set in its worlds, and one of the biggest of those this year has been Space Marine 2, and that's how we've ended up with this. But Warhammer has been around for a while. It is a huge world. It's very all-consuming and can be really confusing for a newcomer to get into. Thankfully, I spend all of my time on this channel telling people about Warhammer lore. So in this video, let's try and go through the episode and just explain what the hell all this stuff actually is. So we open on this bloody-faced, angry little kid who's dragging through the rain a combat knife. The knife is huge, as you can see, because it's a sort of knife used by a Space Marine, the poster faction in Warhammer 40k, and those guys are massive. We don't know what the deal is here, but little kids are important to Space Marines. We hear a voiceover saying how the speaker chose, presumably this child, and how the Imperium breaks children and turns them into killing machines that know no fear, which is the title of the episode, but also a really common saying in Warhammer 40k, particularly how this little kid knew even less fear. We then meet one of our main characters, the owner of that voice, Blade Guard Sergeant Meteorus, being given his mission briefing. So he's got to go and destroy an apostate relic. An apostate is someone who renounces your religion, which is a pretty big thing in 40k. And then he's got to blow it up with ordnance. And his team for this is himself, two other Blade Guard veterans, and Lieutenant Titus, who's the main character from the two Space Marine games. And it looks here like it's very, very dangerous. They're all definitely going to die. That's pretty standard for 40k. So a bit of backstory here for the total newcomers. These guys are Space Marines, the elite military forces used by the Imperium of Man. Space Marines are genetically and technologically enhanced super soldiers. They're taken as small children. Whether they want to is sort of irrelevant, brainwashed and then subjected to loads of invasive surgery until they become superhuman killing machines who live only to kill the enemies of the Emperor. In fact, you can see the results of all that surgery on Meteorus's back in this shot. Those implanted ports will link up with his suit of powered armor. The Space Marines are split up into loads of small independent armies called chapters, each of which has their own culture and symbols, and these guys are all from the Ultramarines chapter. You can tell because of the Ultima, that's the U symbol that's on this readout, and also on the sword that was carried by that kid. And we can also see Meteorus getting his briefing in front of this giant statue of Rabute Gilliman, who's the Primarch, the leader and sort of genetic father of the Ultramarines chapter, and he currently leads the Imperium of Man. Blade Guard veterans are a unit type that the Space Marines field. They're very, very experienced warriors, often with hundreds of years of service, and they're armed with great big shields and power weapons, which are like swords that are energized in some way. The Imperium that they're all fighting for is a totalitarian, authoritarian religious state Again, we'll get into why later. It's a horrible place to live, and to most regular humans, Space Marines are sort of seen as holy angels, which explains all these candles. No one's very happy in the Imperium. Everyone's very serious, especially Space Marines who have been brainwashed so much that they can only sort of be serious or angry. Anyway, the four of them get into a drop pod, which is a vehicle designed to deliver you to the surface in a way that only a Space Marine's enhanced body can really put up with. And they're dropped into the surface to go do this mission. The swirly clouds that we see here suggest that something weird's going on, and as if to reinforce it, we see some clues. There are some bird eggs. That's some foreshadowing, and a piece of parchment with some runes that rebuilds itself, which all suggests warp magic. Again, little lore dump. In 40k, there's this parallel dimension called the warp, which is formed of emotional energy generated by living creatures in the real world. Everyone has a little connection to the warp, but some people are called psychers, and they can manipulate the warp and basically do magic. The issue is that the warp is really, really dangerous, and there are things living in it that humans refer to as either demons or gods, and those things can either grant people great power or like twist and possess them. Unfortunately for the Imperium, the warp is also the main way people get around. It's how ships can travel faster than light, and it's also how interstellar communication works, which is obviously a problem. You can't completely avoid it. One of the main reasons that the Imperium is this hardline religious state is that strong willpower is a very good defense against warp corruption, which means faith is a very good defense against warp corruption, regardless of whether the thing you believe in is true or not. The flip side here is that if you're actually worshipping the gods of the warp, that can be really bad, corrupting whole worlds. The Imperium was originally meant to be secular so that nobody would accidentally worship anything, but when its founder, the Emperor, was mortally wounded, the people in charge found that having their own religion built around the Emperor was kind of good enough, I guess, and after 10,000 years, that's just how the Imperium functions now. The important thing is to be completely unwavering and completely intolerant and completely strong in your beliefs, regardless of if they are correct, which explains a lot about 40k, really. Anyway, this sort of thing means that there's warp magic happening, which makes sense because, as we said, the enemies here are apostates, people who have turned from the Imperium's religion to the worship of something else. Our gang lose their connection to the ship, but they proceed anyway, with Titus carrying this relic box thing. You can tell the three Blade Guard veterans here because they're the guys with shields and with these little circles on their power packs. Those are iron halos that generate an energy field to better protect them. You can tell which one is Titus because he just has his chainsword and bolt gun. That's a chainsaw sword. If you're thinking that's ridiculous, that can't possibly work. Yeah, like, welcome to 40k. They are immediately attacked by these guys, Chaos Cultists. These are humans who have fallen to the worship of the dark powers of the warp, and those are generally not very well resourced, so they're riding these scrappy bikes and buggies. And basically in this scene we get to see how tough Space Marines are. They're greatly outnumbered, but they easily win. They're bursting heads, they ignore gunfire, they knock aside light vehicles like it was nothing, and Titus even leaves his little box to go blow up this tank. Kind of hard to tell from the front, but I think this is intended to be a Lehman Russ tank with a Punisher Gatling cannon on it. The Lehman Russ is a standard battle tank used by the Astra Militarum in 40k. That's the regular human army of the Imperium. And since it's really, really common across the whole galaxy, it's the sort of vehicle that renegades and cultists would have managed to get hold of. You can see that this one is a renegade tank because it's covered in spikes and even more skulls than is normal for the Imperium. As they move forward, even more warp stuff happens. Their purity seals burn off. These are little strips of paper that are affixed to their armor with wax seals for spiritual protection. They burn off because of all the evil warp magic in the air. There's some weird black ooze floating up from the ground. No idea why, that's just a thing that's happening. And they seem to have visions of that little kid again. On they go, sliding down a big hill because they're Space Marines, they don't care about things like gravity. And they go on to their next fight, which is butchering these blue guys. And it's here we get a bit of a sense of what they're going after. These guys are called Zangors. I said earlier, chaos sort of twists things, and Zangors are a sort of chaos-mutated human that's a mix of man, bird, and goat. They're often found in the service of the chaos power Tzeentch, which is one of the big 4 gods that live in the warp, which means that this thing they're trying to destroy is probably a shrine that's dedicated to Tzeentch. Tzeentch is the god of change, magic, and duplicity, and his imagery has lots of birds involved. Remember those eggs from the start? Also, Tzeentch's colour is usually depicted as blue, which is why they've gone for the stylised blue blood look here. So after Fight 2, they continue their stroll into this temple, and look, there's a great big birdie thing there. Looks like a statue of a Lord of Change, which is a big, dangerous demon of Tzeentch. And then Titus finally opens his box, which it turns out contains an astropath. So astropaths are a sort of powerful human psyker. Psykers in the Imperium, while they are essential to its functioning, are also kind of treated like medieval witches. They're shunned and hated and distrusted. Astropaths are psykers who have been sent back to Terra, Earth, to be strengthened by the presence of the God Emperor in a process known as soul binding, which leaves them a lot more powerful, but also blind. It's why this guy has a plate bolted over his eyes. Astropath's primary job is astro-telepathy. That's the main way the Imperium communicates between the stars. Astropaths broadcast psychic messages through the warp to each other, but they're also generally quite powerful psykers. This guy has either been brought to send the message back to the ship or just to provide some psychic defense against all these warp shenanigans. You can see he creates a sort of energy shield against demonic energy from that statue. The Space Marines open fire on the statue with their weapons. Most of them are using bolt weapons. Bolt guns and bolt pistols are the standard sidearm of the Space Marine. They fire bolts, which are these tiny self-propelled rockets designed to explode within the target and basically terrify anyone standing nearby. But you can see that Sergeant Mataris, he carries a plasma pistol, which is like a relic prestige weapon that fires superheated packets of explosive plasma energy. Is that enough to take down a giant statue? Maybe don't worry about that too much. When they start attacking, they wake up this lady, who is listed in the credits as a sorcerer of Tzeentch. Chaos sorcerers are humans who have taken on more and more power from the warp, eventually gaining various horrific and superhuman powers like magic bone wing flight and having one great big eye and wibbly wobbly head tentacles. She actually looks a lot like a character called a Gaunt Summoner from the fantasy version of Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, but they don't really exist in 40k, so we'll just stick with sorcerer here. She kills the astropath with a flying shard of rock, which brings down those psychic defenses, and then she does some time magic to quickly zoom to each of the Marines and get inside their minds. Like a lot of warp shenanigans in 40k, it's unclear exactly what is going on, but it seems like the 4 Marines are made to see their greatest fears, which kind of goes with the title. Our first Marine sees a vision of a young Space Marine neophyte out of his armor, possibly himself as a child, and then when he crushes the neophyte, he's killed, and then we see the second random Blade Guard guy fall over, so presumably the same things happened. The sorcerer then reaches Metaurus. He sees a vision of another Marine child who turns into what looks like Titus. That child at the start was a young Titus, but then this Titus grows chaos spikes and skulls and stabs him. And it's here we need to do a little more specific lore. As I mentioned, Titus is the main character from the Space Marine video games, and loads happens in those, but the basic idea is that Titus happens to be really good at resisting warp corruption, even more than most Space Marines. He keeps finding himself in situations where he's fighting demons and surviving and kind of being okay. And a persistent thread in the games is that other Ultramarines and the Inquisition, the Imperium's secret police, are really suspicious of this, worried that he might in fact be corrupted. After all, why can he seemingly survive contact with it so easily? The Imperium's a really paranoid place for stuff like this. At the end of Space Marine 2, it's implied that Titus is about to be sent on this mission, a mission that involves fighting demons and, as we saw, was projected to kill everybody involved. So maybe the chapter are trying to get rid of him or test him further. If we're to believe the opening voiceover, it looks like Sergeant Meterus is the person who raised Titus, or maybe trained him. And Meterus's big fear is that Titus is corrupted. That's the fear the sorcerer picks out, and so he collapses, wounded. And then finally the sorcerer goes to Titus, but what Titus sees is that angry child holding the Astartes knife, himself as a young boy, and his willpower is so strong that he resists the sorcerer and breaks free, cutting her in two with his combat knife. The deceiving power of the warp, once again beaten by blind rage and anger. And also Titus being really suspiciously good at just resisting warp shenanigans. Anyway, time resumes, and the shots hit the statue, and a big beacon of energy is released. I can't quite tell if this is from the sorcerer dying, or from the statue being exploded, or from the astropath sending that message. But anyway, the ship now can see where the site is and can destroy it from orbit, and they launch their ordnance. Titus then manages to drag the wounded Meterus clear. He calls him Old Man again, which again implies that Meterus was some sort of mentor to Titus. But what is a bit weird is they both have the same number of service studs. These little studs on the forehead are implanted for long service as a space marine. Different chapters have different rules about exactly how long and what materials you need to get your studs, but the fact that Meterus and Titus have the same number of studs in the same material implies that they're like roughly the same age. In the previous games, Titus is shown with silver studs, which could imply a shorter service, but here they kind of look the same, at least on my screen. But on the other hand, a stud could represent 50 or 100 years service, so they could have the same amount and still be 49 or 99 years apart. It's a small thing, who knows. Titus alone then goes back to mop up the renegades, and Meterus comments on how much of an angry badass he is. And that's it. That's our secret level episode. Hopefully, if you're new, that's put it in a little more context. Maybe it's just raised more questions. Is this a good intro to 40k? It's probably a good intro to the video games, which makes sense. This is secret level. Ultramarines being stoic and destroying hundreds of enemies, very little in the way of having to think about it. Titus facing general horrors and suspicious treatment without really any complex dialogue, emotion, or having to think about anything. Yeah, that's kind of accurate to the video games. Is it a good intro to 40k as a whole? Maybe a bit less so. Warhammer lore is huge, and the Ultramarines and all their exploits are just one drop in the ocean. In the tabletop game and in the lore, Titus, for example, just isn't really a big character. And that's pretty common in 40k. A common thread in 40k is that tons of this sort of thing are happening all the time, and no one character is that important. Everyone is disposable. So you could use this as an intro to the world, but bear in mind that the world is a hell of a lot bigger than this, and these guys aren't the main characters or anything. There has again been confirmation that Amazon are investigating doing even bigger Warhammer 40k shows, but I think the general consensus out there is that concentrating on something more human, like say the Inquisition or the Astra Militarum, might work better for a long-form series than just 4 more emotionless space marines punching things. This episode gets the tone right, at least. Despite all their badass action credentials, nobody here is smiling. Even in this brief, narrow snapshot of 40k, it's clear that it's not a nice place. Anyway, if this grim, dark future has sparked your interest, take a look at the rest of the channel. I've got a whole playlist for newcomers that gives a broad overview of the world, the tone of the setting, and all the different factions, at least enough to get you started. And there are hundreds of hours of video content, audiobooks, games, and novels out there for you to dive into if you want. Until then, thanks for watching. And it turns out a load of people watch this stuff. If you'd like to support the channel, you could join them on Patreon or in YouTube memberships, or you could buy some merch. There's some links down below in the description to all that stuff. See ya!